Welcome back to Concorde Week on Podcasting on a Plane. This is the week where each day we're sitting down with retired Concorde captain John Hutchinson. Now, last time John told us all about how he went from birth in India to joining the Royal Air Force, flying corporate in Europe in the 60s, to getting hired at BOAC and eventually flying the 707, the VC-10, the 747, and ultimately being selected to fly Concorde. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to the last episode. Each episode this week is going to go in chronological order, so make sure that you've listened to the previous one before you get to the next. Today, John tells us what it was like to train on Concorde, and as you might imagine, it wasn't like other airplanes to learn. But first, John recounts his harrowing escape from a burning 707 fuselage at Heathrow, and how a well-trained cabin crew was the not-so-secret ingredient to their successful escape. Plus, he throws in some fun editorial about how the incident was covered in the media at the time. If you have feedback for me or for John, head on over to podcastingonaplane.com/contact and let us know what's on your mind. And I'm proud to finally announce that after a bit of difficulty, I now have the email address brandon@podcastingonaplane.com, so you can just shoot me an email straight up anytime you want. As before, I know the audio quality is going to be a little wonky, but what John has to say is so good that I didn't want to miss the opportunity to get these interviews to you all. So, without further ado, let's welcome back Concorde Captain John Hutchinson.
The Whiskey Echo incident. Yeah, that was an interesting exercise. It was a spring day. It was April 1968. It was a beautiful, beautiful spring day. Glorious weather. 8/8 sunshine. We were very fortunate. The flight was only going from Heathrow, London Heathrow, to Zurich. Because in those days, the way BOAC did its flights out to Australia was to go to a European destination first, and the European destinations were Zurich, Frankfurt, or Rome, and you'd then go to somewhere like Tehran, and then you'd go to Delhi, and then you'd go to Singapore, and then you go to Perth, and then you go to Sydney. It was that sort of thing. You were going up and down all the time on your way out to Australia. We were scheduled just to do this first sector of this flight out to Australia, London to Zurich. So the consequence of this was that we didn't have much fuel on board. I mean, the flight to Zurich's, about an hour and a half, something like that, an hour and 3/4. So we'd probably got about 3.5 hours fuel on board this 707. So it was a very light aircraft. We had about 126 passengers, I think it was, 6 cabin crew, and a very full flight deck. We had a captain, a senior first officer, a flight engineer, a route check captain, and me, the junior chap on board, sitting at the navigator's station on that flight. And really all I can tell you about it is that everything it was quite normal. We taxied out, we got our takeoff clearance, we got airborne, and about 20 seconds after we got airborne, there was this enormous bang and a lurch. And the captain called for a severe engine failure drill. I absolutely know in my own mind, I never saw a fire warning, and I never heard a fire bell ringing on the flight deck. As we were going, I wasn't doing this at all because I was sitting right at the back of the flight deck, but as the other crew members, first officer and flight engineer, were going through the severe engine failure drill, the route check captain, who's sitting in the jump seat immediately behind the operating captain, peered sort of down the back of the left wing out of the side window on the flight deck and said something like, "Oh, bloody hell." I think the language was slightly more colourful than that, but "oh, bloody hell" will do. The wing is on fire. And that was the first I knew that we actually had a fire on board the aeroplane. So we're in this turn to the left, having taken off on runway 28 left in a westerly direction. We're now in a left turn having had this enormous bang and a lurch and a thump, and I now know that we've got an aircraft on fire. And the captain immediately orders a fire drill to be carried out. So the poor old senior first officer now has to go from a severe engine failure drill into a fire drill. And the captain who was flying the airplane said to the first officer, asked for clearance to return to Heathrow to land back on the runway that we'd taken off from, runway 28 left. At this point, the route check captain said, absolutely not. He said, you've got to get this airplane on the ground as soon as possible. He said, you need to land on 05. Now, in those days, Heathrow had a cross runway, a northeast, southwest facing runway, which is now no longer there. It's now a taxiway. In those days, back in 1968, it was a runway, a short runway. It was only about 6,000 feet long, so it didn't have a great deal of length to it. And the handling captain did not want to land on that short runway. The 707 wasn't a particularly easy airplane to land, and he absolutely did not want to land on a short runway with a wing on fire. And the route check captain, more or less in the end, said, look, I'm not asking you to land on 05. He said, I'm telling you to, because that wing is going to burn through, and if it burns through, we shall be crashing into the middle of London somewhere if you sort of try and do a circuit to land back on the runway we took off from. So rather reluctantly, the handling captain said, gave in to this pressure that was being put on him and agreed that he would land on 05. This meant that the senior first officer and the flight engineer had to go through a whole lot of checks. They had to complete the fire drill. They had to carry out a top of descent check, a field approach check, a landing check. I mean, they were working like one-arm paper hangers. And there was no instrument landing system, by the way, on 05. So the captain who was flying it had to visually judge his approach and landing. And I have to say, having been persuaded into landing on 05, much against his will, he then did a fantastic job. He landed right at the beginning of 05, and furthermore, he did a beautiful, smooth landing, a real greaser of a landing. And I think that was probably very significant, because I think by this stage, the left wing had been quite severely damaged, and if he'd done a thumping, heavy landing, it's quite possible, I believe, that the wing might have broken off, and we might have then ended up sort of cartwheeling around all over Heathrow Airport. As it was, he did this beautiful smooth landing, brought the airplane to a halt, a nice smooth halt on 05, and then ordered an emergency evacuation. Now, the evacuation could only be done from two exits, from the front galley exit on the right-hand side and from the right-hand over-wing exit. Everything on the left-hand side of the airplane was awash with burning fuel. Absolutely awash with burning fuel. If anybody wants to look it up, if they Google Whiskey Echo, I'm quite sure you'll find on the internet all sorts of photographs of that airplane burning up at Heathrow, and you'll see what I mean. It was so it was not possible to use any of the exits on the left-hand side, nor was it possible to use the right-hand rear exit either, because what had happened was, during the short period of our flight, I think the total flight time was about 3.5 minutes, the flames from the burning wing had been impacting on the tail fin, and it had sort of superheated the metal, if you like. And as we stopped on the runway, and there's no cooling airflow going over it anymore, that superheated metal just burst into flames spontaneously, and the fire worked its way up the fuselage from the rear end of the aeroplane. So it worked its way, progressed its way forwards up the length of the aeroplane from the rear to the front. So that's the way the fire progressed. Now, the cabin crew were absolutely outstanding. And I do a full-blooded talk about this on cruise ships, for instance, to emphasize to people what cabin crew are really on an airplane for. They're not there to serve coffee and tea and make you feel happy and comfortable and pampered. They're there, in legal terms, to get you out of an airplane if all else has gone horribly wrong. And it's on the premise that if there's been a crash, that the flight crew might well be incapacitated, and it's going to be down to the cabin crew to organize the whole evacuation. Now, this cabin crew on this particular day were absolutely outstanding. And I think the passengers were almost more frightened of the cabin crew than they were of the smoke and the flames and the explosions that would take place from time to time. A tire would explode or a fuel tank would explode and the airplane would lurch one way or the other. I mean, it's very, very dramatic sort of event, I can tell you.
Well, Whiskey Echo, when it came to the emergency evacuation, really did come down to the cabin crew and the role of the cabin crew. And the cabin crew we had on that flight, on that day, were absolutely fantastic. Bear in mind, once we'd stopped on runway 05, the fire was progressing up from the tail of the airplane, working its way up the fuselage towards the front end. And it was quite dramatic. You know, there was black smoke coming up the fuselage, dense black smoke. There was fire and flames. And every now and then there'd be an explosion and the airplane would sort of lurch one way or another as a tire exploded or a fuel tank blew up. And it had all the potential for creating panic amongst the 126 passengers who were on board. I think those passengers were more frightened of the cabin crew than they were of all the dynamic happenings that were going on around them. And I will never, ever forget watching these passengers disembarking from the forward galley slide on the right-hand side of the airplane, just standing there in a meek, calm, orderly line, waiting for their turn to go down the slide. It was just amazing. I didn't have to do a thing. About 100 or so of the passengers went down that front galley slide. The other 20 or so passengers went out over the right-hand over wing exit and then jumped off the wing onto the concrete below. And most of those ended up with broken legs or broken ankles. But, you know, they were alive. I eventually got off the airplane. Actually, by pure happenstance, I was the last person off the airplane. I found myself up there in the front forward galley area with the captain, just the two of us, nobody else around, and we're shouting and yelling and saying, is there anybody left? And we couldn't see more than about 3 or 4 inches in front of us. I mean, it was black smoke you could have picked up in handfuls and thrown overboard. I mean, it really was. It was a physical entity, that smoke. Quite amazing. And we did the best we could in terms of ensuring that there was nobody else there. And the captain said, look, he said, we'll go back onto the flight deck and we'll go down using the escape ropes from the flight deck window. So he went through first into the flight deck. I followed, shut the door behind me to stop the smoke coming up onto the flight deck. And he went down the slide, down the rope, and I followed him. And you're supposed to go down these ropes, of course, sort of hand over hand. Well, I had hot, sweaty hands, and I slid down this rope with sort of smoke pouring out of my fingers. There's no way I was going to be going down hand over hand, and that was the only injury I had, was severe sort of rope burns on my fingers. Anyway, at this stage, we were taken away, the 5 flight crew members. I didn't see anything of the cabin crew. They were taken away separately from us. And we were taken off to the medical center. And it was then that we found out that sadly 4 passengers and a stewardess who was at the back of the airplane, the rear galley stewardess, Barbara Harrison, had died. And the other thing we learned when we were in the British Airways Medical, or BOAC Medical Center, was that one of our engines had fallen off. We lost our number 2 engine, and it had fallen off into a gravel pit about a few miles southwest of Heathrow. I haven't said yet what was the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem was, the whole incident was a catastrophic failure of that number 2 engine. It had literally blown up. The compressor had blown apart. Bits of metal had penetrated the wing and ruptured fuel tanks. Fuel had poured out onto the engine, and that's what had caused the wing to catch fire. And the heat of the fire had burned through the pylons that connected that number 2 engine to the wing, and the wing, the engine, as I had just said, fell off and landed in the gravel pit. And there are always bits of black humor in these things. There was a newspaper headline the following day saying that the brilliant captain had ejected or jettisoned his flaming engine into a gravel pit. It makes me laugh sometimes when you read these things in the media. Like there's a sort of ejection handle for an engine you've decided you don't like any longer. Oh yeah, I think I'll just dump that engine. And the idea that we could furthermore aim that engine to land in a gravel pit as opposed to landing in the middle of some built-up area is just so utterly laughable. It's so preposterous, but there we are. That's what the media does sometimes. Anyway, that's really sort of a thumbnail sketch of what happened in Whiskey Echo. It was quite an experience. It's not one I'd want to go through again. And the main point I would make and emphasize is that if you've got a well-trained cabin crew on board an airplane when things go horribly wrong, your chances of surviving that experience are greatly, greatly enhanced. They really are.
Did you start, or did they start you as a first officer, or were you able to go straight in as a captain?
No, the way British Airways works is that once you're a captain, you're a captain. And any further type that you convert onto, you go onto that type in your rank as a captain. So, yes, I went on to Concorde as a captain. And remember, I'd only been a captain on VC-10s for 15 months at this stage. So it was a pretty short time scale, really, when you think about it. The first thing I'd say about the training on Concorde is that you really had to be very, very determined that it was Concorde you wanted to get onto, because the course was unrelenting. It was extremely hard work, and I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that. It really was. I have never done a course like it before or since. It was 6 months, And remember, everybody who's going onto that aeroplane was already a very, very experienced pilot, whether they were captains, whether they were first officers, or indeed a very experienced flight engineer. They were all extremely experienced airmen. And here they were doing a 6-month course. Now, I don't know how long it takes to convert onto a Boeing 787 from a Boeing 737, for instance, but I suspect you're talking probably a matter of a few weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I don't know, something like that. This was 6 months. Now, the ground school itself lasted about 8 weeks, and you had 5 days in class every week with an examination at the end of the week on your week's work, and you had to get over 90% in all categories of the ground school work that you'd done. And that went on week after week after week for 8 weeks. At the end of it, it was followed by a type rating examination set by the Civil Aviation Authority. And I can't remember, it was something like 300 questions or something like that in this exam. And again, you had to get at least 90% in all sections in order to pass it. Having done that ground school, you then went off and flew the flight simulator, and it was something like 85 hours of time in the flight simulator. And during that time in the flight simulator, you explored every aspect of the Concorde operation, absolutely everything. The one thing that British Airways was absolutely determined about was that they were not going to have an accident with Concorde, because they knew that if ever there was an accident, bearing in mind what a political airplane Concorde was, it could spell the end of the project. So they put the most enormous emphasis into the quality of the training. So after 85 hours in the flight simulator, we then went off. In my case, we went to Royal Air Force Brize Norton, where we did about 8 hours, circuits and bumps, takeoffs and touchdowns out of Brize Norton, doing all the sort of stuff you'd expect: 3 engine failures after takeoff, 3 engine landings, and we also practiced a 2 engine landing as well in the air as a real thing on the aeroplane. And once you'd done that, you were then stamped up and had your type rating on Concorde, but you were still not approved as an operator by the airline. You then had to do 3 months training down the line, carrying passengers, flying with one of the already qualified Concorde crew members. They had what were called a nucleus group of captains and co-pilots and flight engineers who'd been posted to British Aerospace, the manufacturer, before the aeroplane ever entered service, and they'd done their training with people like Brian Trubshaw and John Cochrane, and they became the nucleus group of people who'd already been trained by the manufacturer, who then became the people who would train the subsequent pilots who came onto the airplane in the airline. So that was 3 months, as I say, of flying down the route with another captain who'd already been trained by the manufacturer. And at the end of that 3 months flying down the route, you were finally stamped up and validated as a Concorde captain in British Airways. So that's just a sketch about the training involved. It was a very intense and very tough training course. There's no question about that.
We're only halfway done. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's episode, where John shares the stories of how he became the unofficial British spokesperson on the subject of Concorde. He was a BBC correspondent and became a friend of the royal family. And make sure to pick up John's book, Wind Beneath My Wings. If you want to read more about this and those other stories, there's a link in the show notes so you can be up and reading in less than a minute. Until next time, your frequency change is approved, and report back on this frequency tomorrow for episode 3 of Concorde Week. Good day.